The buzzards circled lazy in the unforgiving canvas of the Arizona sky, a grim premonition. Down below, dust and blood mingled on the cracked earth, marking the spot where betrayal had a name, and a bullet whispered a deadly promise. He was a ghost in the making, a man stripped of everything, but the agonizing throb of life fading with each stolen breath. They thought the river would be his grave, a final silent witness. But the river, that ancient winding serpent, had other plans. It carried him broken and bleeding to an unlikely angel, a farm girl with hands calloused by hardship and a spirit as wild as the frontier itself. This ain't just a tale of survival. It's a story of reckoning, where the price of a life is paid in grit, and the deadliest shots come not from a gun, but from the heart. The sun, a malevolent eye in the vast cerulean expanse, beat down on Jedediah Jed Stone as he rode. His duster, the color of desert dust itself, offered little protection from the relentless heat. The air was thick with the scent of sagebrush and the distant metallic tang of something else, something that prickled the hairs on the back of his neck. He'd been a fool to trust them. A damn fool. Jed wasn't a man prone to sentimentality, not anymore. The war between the states had seen to that, carving away the softer edges of his youth, leaving behind a man hardened by loss and tempered by survival. But Silas, with his easy grin and promises of a legitimate venture, a chance to finally build something instead of running from everything, had chipped away at Jed's cynicism. Silas and his two shadows, Cutter and Finn. They were supposed to be partners, scouting a new cattle trail through the Cimarron territory. Jed, with his knowledge of the land, was invaluable. Or so Silas had claimed. The cattle trail had turned out to be a thinly veiled excuse to get Jed deep into the desolate backcountry, far from any prying eyes or helping hands. The realization had dawned too late. One moment they were sharing lukewarm coffee around a meager campfire, the next Silas's smile had curdled into something predatory. Cutter, a hulking brute with eyes like chips of obsidian, had moved with surprising speed. Jed had felt the cold press of a gun barrel against his temple before he could even reach for the Colt Patterson holstered low on his hip, the very same model his father had carried, a relic of a bygone era, but reliable as the sunrise. "Sorry," Jedediah Silas had drawled, his voice smooth as viper's oil. "Turns out your share is a little too rich for our blood." The first bullet had torn through Jed's shoulder, spinning him around with a grunt of agony. He'd staggered, his vision blurring, but instinct honed by countless skirmishes and desperate flights had taken over. He'd lunged not at Silas, but at the skittish pack mule carrying their supplies, hoping to create a diversion. Finn, wiry and quick, had intercepted him with the butt of his rifle, a sickening crack echoing as it connected with Jed's ribs. Pain, white-hot and blinding, had erupted in his chest. He'd gone down gasping, the taste of blood and dust filling his mouth. Through a haze of agony, he saw Cutter raise his pistol again. Jed had closed his eyes, a bitter curse forming on his lips. But instead of the expected shot, he heard Silas's sharp command. "Not here. Too messy. The river's close. Let it carry him away." No trace. Rough hands had hauled him up. He was a dead weight, his strength ebbing with the crimson tide soaking his shirt. They dragged him, his boots kicking up small spurts of dust towards the mocking gurgle of the Cimarron River, its waters a muddy brown swollen from the recent spring melt. He remembered the glint of the sun on the water, the mocking calls of crows overhead. He remembered Silas's face, impassive as Cutter and Finn heaved him towards the precipice of the riverbank. "Consider this a lesson in trust," Jedediah Silas had said, his voice distant as if coming from the end of a long tunnel. Then another searing pain, this one in his side. And the world had tilted. He was falling, tumbling through the air, the sky and the earth, a chaotic blur. The impact with the cold water had stolen what little breath he had left. The current was a relentless, churning beast. It clawed at him, dragging him under, tumbling him over rocks and submerged logs. His head struck something hard, and a shower of stars exploded behind his eyelids. He fought a primal instinct to survive, warring with the crushing weight of his injuries and the icy grip of the river. But his limbs were heavy, unresponsive. Water filled his lungs, burning, suffocating. Darkness, absolute and terrifying, began to encroach upon his vision. He saw faces in the swirling blackness. His brother fallen at Gettysburg. His mother, her eyes full of sorrow. Was this it? Was this the ignoble end to Jedediah Stone, shot by men he'd mistakenly called partners, left to rot in an unmarked, watery grave? The fight went out of him. He was sinking, the sun-dappled surface receding above a fading memory of light and life. The last thing he felt was a strange sort of peace, a surrender to the inevitable. Then nothing. The Cimarron River, ancient and indifferent, carried its silent burden downstream, away from the scene of betrayal, towards an unknowable fate. The buzzards continued their patient vigil, cheated of their immediate prize, but confident that the land or the river would eventually offer up its due. They hadn't counted on Abigail. The sun was a molten coin, just beginning its descent towards the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange when Abigail Hester first saw him. She'd been down by the Cimarron, a ritual she'd maintained since she was a girl, checking the snares she set for rabbits, and more often than not, simply listening to the river's ceaseless song. It was a lonely comfort in a life that had seen too much quiet hardship. Her farm, a modest spread of sun-baked earth and weathered timber, was a good 2 miles up from this particular bend in the river. Her father, a man whose dreams had turned to dust long before he himself had claimed this land, hoping for prosperity. What he'd found was back-breaking labor and an early grave. Her mother, a woman whose resilience Abigail had inherited in spades, had followed him a few years later, worn down by grief and the unforgiving land. Now, at 22, Abigail ran the farm alone. Her only companions, a stubborn mule named Jericho, and a handful of scrawny chickens. She was a striking figure, though few ever saw her to appreciate it. Her hair, the color of ripe wheat, was usually plaited tightly to keep it from her face, but stray wisps always managed to escape, framing a face that was all sharp angles and fierce determination. Her eyes the clear, startling blue of a desert sky after a storm missed little. That evening, they missed nothing. At first, she thought it was a log snagged on the gnarled roots of a fallen cottonwood near the river's edge. But then a flicker of movement, a glint of something that wasn't wood or stone. Her heart, usually a steady, reliable drum, gave a startled thump. She approached cautiously, her bare feet making little sound on the damp earth. The air hung heavy, the usual chorus of crickets and frogs, strangely subdued. As she drew closer, the shape resolved itself. A man, or what was left of one. He was sprawled face down, half in and half out of the water, his clothes torn and dark with what could only be blood and river mud. One arm was flung out, fingers splayed as if reaching for something just beyond his grasp. He was still terrifyingly still. Abigail's first instinct was to run. Run back to the dubious safety of her small cabin. bolt the door, and pretend she'd seen nothing. This was trouble, the kind her mother had always warned her about, the kind that clung to men like trail dust and usually ended in gunfire or the gallows. Men like this didn't just wash up on riverbanks, they were sent. She took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. But then a sound, a faint, ragged gasp, so quiet it was almost lost beneath the murmur of the river. He was alive. Her fear warred with a deeper, more ingrained instinct, the one that made her mend a bird's broken wing, the one that forced her to replant crops after a hailstorm. It was a stubborn refusal to let life be so easily extinguished. Cursing her own foolishness under her breath, she waded into the shallows. The water, even in the late spring, was bitingly cold. She reached him, her hands hesitating before they touched his shoulder. "Mister," she called out softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Mister, can you hear me?" There was no response, only another shallow, hitching breath. Gently she rolled him over. The sight made her stomach churn. His face was a mess of cuts and bruises, his lips blue. A dark, ugly stain spread across his chest and side. He was big, heavier than he looked, and his skin was cold, clammy. But his eyes, though closed, flickered faintly beneath their lids. A spark. She couldn't leave him here. The coyotes would find him before the night was out, or the river would reclaim him with the next surge. He'd die. "All right, mister," she muttered, more to herself than to him, her voice tight with a mixture of resolve and trepidation. "Looks like you've found yourself a stubborn fool." Getting him out of the water was a monumental struggle. He was a dead weight, and Abigail, though strong from years of farm work, was no match for his inert bulk. She pulled, she strained her muscles, screaming in protest. She slipped on the muddy bank, her knees scraping against sharp stones. For a moment, she thought she'd have to abandon him, that he was simply too heavy, too far gone. But then she remembered her father, his face pale and drawn as he lay dying in their small cabin. The doctor too far away, too expensive. She remembered the helplessness, the gnawing guilt. She wouldn't feel that again, not if she could help it. With a renewed surge of adrenaline fueled by a desperate compassion, she heaved again. This time he moved just a little. Inch by agonizing inch, she dragged him further up the bank, away from the grasping fingers of the current. Finally, with a last gasping effort, she pulled him clear, his sodden form collapsing onto the dry earth. She stood over him, panting her chest, aching her hands raw. He looked even worse in the fading light. Death still clung to him like a shroud, but he was breathing shallowly, erratically, but breathing. Now what, her cabin was nearly 2 miles away. She couldn't possibly carry him. Jericho. Her stubborn, cantankerous mule was her only hope. But getting this man onto Jericho's back would be another ordeal entirely. "Don't you die on me, mister," she whispered, kneeling beside him, her fingers searching for a pulse at his neck. It was there, weak and thready, but there. "Don't you dare die after all this trouble." The sky was bleeding its last light. The stars, cold and distant, were beginning to prick the darkening velvet. Abigail knew she had to hurry. She looked at the broken man at her feet, a stranger delivered by the river, a harbinger of unknown dangers. A profound sense of unease settled over her, but beneath it, a stubborn flicker of hope and a dawning realization that her solitary, predictable life had just been irrevocably altered by the current of the Cimarron. The journey back to the cabin was a nightmare. Abigail, driven by a desperate urgency, managed to half drag, half cajole the unconscious man onto Jericho's broad back. The mule, true to his nature, protested with loud brays and flattened ears, but Abigail's firm hand and whispered pleas eventually won out. She walked beside the swaying mule, one hand holding the stranger in place, the other guiding Jericho through the darkness, the familiar path now fraught with a new unnerving tension. The stranger's cabin, for it was his now in a way, was small, just 2 rooms, but it was clean and orderly. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a testament to Abigail's practicality. She maneuvered him onto her own narrow bed, the only one in the cabin grunting with the effort. His wet, muddy clothes were a further problem. With a deep breath and a sense of clinical detachment, she didn't quite feel she began the awkward task of stripping them from his unresponsive form. The extent of his injuries was horrifying. 2 bullet wounds, one high on his left shoulder, oozing sluggishly, the other on his right side, angrier, more inflamed. Ugly, purpling bruises ached across his ribs and jaw. He was feverish, his skin radiating a dry heat that alarmed her. For the next few days, Abigail's life revolved around the unconscious man. She cleaned his wounds as best she could, using boiled water and a bar of harsh lye soap. She had a small stash of herbs her mother had taught her to use, willow bark for fever, comfrey for mending. And she applied poultices with a hopeful prayer. She spooned broth painstakingly made from a scrawny chicken between his cracked lips, most of it dribbling back out. She sat by his bedside, listening to his labored breathing, the rasping coughs that shook his battered frame, and the occasional muttered words that made no sense. Names escaped his lips in fevered whispers. Silas. Cutter. Damn you. Painting fragments of a violent past. He'd flinch and cry out, his hands clenching, as if fighting invisible demons. During those moments, Abigail would speak to him softly, her voice a soothing balm in the oppressive heat of his delirium, though she doubted he could hear her. She learned the contours of his face, the harsh lines etched by sun, and hardship softened now by vulnerability. There was a scar above his left eyebrow, white and faded, another nicking his chin. His hands, though calloused and strong, were well shaped. He was a man who had lived and lived hard. She found herself wondering about him, about the life that had led him to her riverbank shot and left for dead. Was he a good man? A bad one? Did it matter? He was alive, and she was fighting for it. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of care and worry. The farm, her sole means of survival, was neglected. The weeds were encroaching on her small vegetable patch. The chickens wandered uncared for, but she couldn't bring herself to leave his side for long. Each small improvement, a lessening of the fever, a deeper breath, a moment of stillness not born of unconsciousness, was a victory she clung to. Slowly, agonizingly, he began to surface from the depths. His eyes, when they first opened, were clouded with confusion and pain. They were a startling hazel, flecked with gold, and they fixed on her with a raw intensity that made her catch her breath. Water. He rasped, his voice a dry, cracked whisper. Abigail, her heart leaping, rushed to his side with a dipper of fresh well water. She supported his head, helping him drink. He coughed, choked, but managed to swallow a few sips. Where? He managed, looking around the small, unfamiliar cabin, his gaze lingering on the rough-hewn wooden walls, the simple patchwork quilt. My cabin, Abigail replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Near the Cimarron. I found you by the river." He stared at her, his brow furrowed. Fragments of memory seemed to flicker in his eyes. The ambush, the icy water, the darkness. "River," he murmured. They shot me." "Yes," Abigail said softly. "You were in a bad way." He tried to sit up, a groan escaping his lips as pain lanced through him. Abigail gently pushed him back down. "Easy now. You've been hurt bad. You need to rest." Over the next week, his recovery was slow, punctuated by bouts of pain and lingering weakness. He slept a lot, but when he was awake he watched her, his gaze unsettling. He learned her name, Abigail, and she learned his, Jedediah or Jed. He spoke little, answering her questions with curt, non-committal replies. He was a closed book, his past a shadowy landscape he was unwilling to illuminate. Abigail, in turn, was cautious. She told him about her farm, her life, but kept a certain distance. There was an aura of danger about him, an unspoken threat that lingered in the air. Who were the men who had shot him? Would they come looking for him? And what would happen to her if they did? The first tangible sign of trouble came not from Jed, but from the world outside her isolated existence. Old Man Hemlock, a grizzled trapper who lived a few miles further downriver and occasionally traded pelts for Abigail's eggs and vegetables, stopped by her cabin. He was a man of few words, his face a road map of wrinkles and suspicion. Heard tell some folks were asking questions in perdition. Hemlock said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near a fence post. Perdition was the closest thing to a town, a dusty collection of saloons, a general store, and an apathetic sheriff's office a good half-day's ride away. Abigail's stomach tightened. What kind of questions Hemlock squinted at her, his gaze sharp. Asking about a man, a stranger, maybe seen floating down the Cimarron. Said he was a thief run off with their money. He paused, then added, offered a reward. Abigail forced herself to remain calm, to meet his gaze without flinching. Haven't seen anyone like that. River's been high, could have washed anything away. Hemlock grunted, his eyes lingering on her cabin door for a moment too long before he finally nodded. Likely. Just thought I'd mention it. Folks get mighty interested when there's money involved. He tipped his hat, a gesture that was more habit than courtesy, and ambled off, leaving Abigail with a cold knot of fear in her belly. She didn't tell Jed about Hemlock's visit, not immediately. But the trapper's words hung in the air between them, unspoken, but understood. Someone was looking for him, and Perdition, with its dusty streets and loose tongues, was not that far away. The sanctuary of her isolated farm suddenly felt fragile, vulnerable. The quiet rhythm of her life had been broken, and the ripples of Jedediah Stone's violent past were spreading, threatening to engulf her too. The man she had pulled from the river was no longer just a patient. He was a liability, a danger. And yet as she looked at his slowly mending form, at the stubborn flicker of life in his hazel eyes, she knew she couldn't turn him out. Not yet. The price of her compassion, she was beginning to realize, might be far higher than she had ever imagined. Jedediah Stone was not a man accustomed to helplessness. Lying in Abigail's narrow bed, his body a symphony of aches and stabs, he felt like a swart wolf. His strength was returning, but with agonizing slowness. Each day he pushed himself, testing his limits, his frustration mounting. The colt, Patterson. His constant companion for so many years lay cleaned and oiled on the small table beside the bed. a comforting weight in an uncertain world. Abigail had found it tucked inside his sodden waistband when she'd undressed him, its presence a silent testament to the life he'd lived. His memory, too, was returning piecemeal at first, then in a flood of bitter clarity. Silas. The glint of greed in his eyes, the casual cruelty in his voice. Cutter's brutish face, Finn's nervous energy. They'd been after the map, of course. The map he'd inherited from a dying prospector in a dusty cantina in Chihuahua. A map rumored to lead to the lost San Saba gold mine, a legend whispered around campfires for decades. Jed had dismissed it as fanciful, another prospector's pipe dream, until Silas, with his uncanny ability to sniff out opportunity, had caught wind of it. Silas hadn't believed in sharing. He'd wanted it all, and he'd been willing to kill for it. Jed listened to the sounds of Abigail's life. The rhythmic chop of an axe as she split firewood, the soft clucking of her chickens, the murmur of her voice as she coaxed Jericho. She moved with a quiet efficiency, a resilience that both impressed and unsettled him. She had saved his life, no doubt about it. And in doing so, she had unknowingly stepped into the path of men who would not hesitate to harm her to get to him. The news from Old Man Hemlock, which Abigail finally relayed to him a few days after the trapper's visit, her voice tight with worry, confirmed his fears. Asking about a man, a thief, run off with their money. Silas, true to form, was twisting the narrative, painting Jed as the villain. The reward would make every desperate man in the territory a potential threat. They'll come, Jed said, his voice flat. He was sitting up now, propped against the wall, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains visible through the cabin's small window. Silas won't give up. Not with that map. Map. Abigail asked, her hands stilling from their task of mending one of his torn shirts. Jed hesitated. He owed her the truth, or at least part of it. A map to an old Spanish mine. Supposedly. That's what this is all about. He didn't mention the gold. No need to put that particular temptation in her mind, though he suspected Abigail Hester was driven by more than avarice. And they think you still have it. Jed's hand instinctively went to his side, where he'd always carried his money belt. It was gone, of course. Silas and his dogs would have taken it along with his horse and saddlebags. They'll think I memorized it, or have it hidden. He met her gaze, his own hard. They won't stop until they have it, or they're sure I can't lead them to it, which meant they wouldn't stop until he was dead. Truly dead this time. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air. What about her? Abigail, however, didn't voice it. Instead, she surprised him. Then you need to get stronger. Faster. Her chin was set, her blue eyes glinting with a resolve that matched his own. This farm, it's all I have. I won't let them destroy it. There was a fierce protectiveness in her voice, not just for her farm, but for him too, he realized with a jolt. It was a sentiment he hadn't encountered in a long, long time. It made him uneasy. Attachments were dangerous. Attachments got people killed. The days that followed were filled with a new urgency. Jed pushed himself harder, forcing his protesting muscles to obey. He started walking first within the confines of the cabin, then venturing outside, leaning heavily on a sturdy branch Abigail had fashioned into a crude crutch. The fresh air, the sun on his face, invigorated him. He watched Abigail work her movements, economical and strong. She handled an axe better than many men he knew. She was a survivor just like him, albeit of a different kind of war. One afternoon, as he sat on the porch cleaning his Colt Patterson with meticulous care. He saw a plume of dust in the distance heading towards the farm. It wasn't the meandering trail of a lone rider like Hemlock. This was more direct, more purposeful. "Company," he said, his voice low. Abigail, who was mending a fence line near the barn, straightened up her hand, shielding her eyes. She too saw the dust cloud. Her face paled slightly, but her expression remained determined. "Get inside, Jed," she said, her voice calm but firm. "And take this." She unslung the old Winchester rifle she always kept close when working outdoors. It was an older model, well used but clearly cared for. "I don't know who it is, but best be prepared." Jed took the rifle, its familiar weight a grim comfort. His shoulder still protested sharp movements, but he could handle it. "What about you?" "I'll meet them," she said. "It's my farm. They have no reason to suspect anything." She glanced at him. "Stay out of sight. Don't make a sound unless you have to." He nodded, retreating into the shadows of the cabin, positioning himself near the window, where he could see without being seen. His heart hammered against his ribs, a familiar drumbeat of impending conflict. He watched as two riders emerged from the dust, reining in their horses near the patched fence. He recognized them instantly, not Silas, but his hounds, Cutter and Finn. Cutter, immense and glowering, dismounted heavily, his gun belt slung low. Finn, smaller, twitchier, remained in the saddle, his eyes darting around, taking in the small farm with a nervous energy. Abigail walked towards them, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. Jed's hand tightened on the Winchester. He could try to take them both now a surprise attack, but his aim might be off his strength not fully returned. And if he missed, Abigail would be caught in the crossfire. He had to trust her for now. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Abigail's voice carried clearly to him, steady and devoid of fear. Cutter looked her up and down, a leering smile spreading across his coarse features. "Well now, what have we here? A pretty little flower all alone in the wilderness." Finn snickered nervously. "This is private property." Abigail stated, her voice hardening. "State your business." "Looking for a man," Cutter said, his smile fading. "Goes by the name of Jedediah Stone." Tall fella answers to Jed. "Seen him?" Jed watched Abigail's face. She didn't flinch. "Can't say I have. Don't get many visitors out here. He'd be hurt." Finn piped up, his voice thin and reedy. "Maybe real bad. We had a disagreement. He fell in the river up a ways. The Cimarron's been running high and fast." Abigail said, her gaze unwavering. Anything could have happened to him, or anyone. Cutter took a step closer to her, his bulk intimidating. "We heard someone might have pulled a fella matching his description out of the water. Someone living right around here." His eyes narrowed. "You wouldn't be lying to us, would you, ma'am, Silas? He don't take kindly to folks lying to him, especially when it concerns his property." Jed's finger tightened on the trigger. The implication was clear. They considered him property, or at least what he knew. Abigail stood her ground. "I haven't seen your man, and I don't appreciate being threatened on my own land." There was a spark of defiance in her eyes, now a dangerous glint. "If you're done, I have work to do." Cutter chuckled a low, unpleasant sound. "Feisty. I like feisty." He looked around the small farm again, his gaze lingering on the cabin. "Nice little place you got here. Be a shame if anything happened to it." He paused, then turned back to Abigail. "We'll be around, in perdition. If you happen to remember anything or see anything unusual, you come find us. There's a reward, you know. For information leading to Jedediah Stone." He swung himself back onto his horse, Finn still fidgeting beside him. Cutter gave Abigail one last, long look. "We'll be seeing you, ma'am." They turned their horses and rode off, kicking up another cloud of dust, leaving behind a silence that was more menacing than their words. Abigail stood watching them go, her shoulders rigid. Only when they were out of sight did she finally let out a shaky breath, her composure crumbling slightly. She turned and walked back towards the cabin, her face pale but set. Jed emerged from the shadows, the Winchester still in his grip. "You did good, Abigail," he said, his voice rough. "You did real good." She looked at him, her blue eyes troubled. "They'll be back, Jed. They know, or they suspect enough." "I know," he said. The time for hiding was over. The past hadn't just caught up. It had knocked on the door, and soon it would try to kick it down. He was tired of running, tired of recovering. He was a fighter, not a fugitive. And now he wasn't just fighting for his own life or for a mythical treasure. He was fighting for the stubborn, courageous woman who had pulled him from the river, the woman who now stood beside him, her fate intertwined with his. The thought was both terrifying and strangely liberating. The visit from Cutter and Finn cast a long, ominous shadow over the small farm. The fragile peace Abigail had cultivated was shattered, replaced by a gnawing tension that thickened the air like summer humidity. Every creak of the cabin floorboards, every distant coyote howl sent jolts of anxiety through them. Jed, his strength returning more rapidly, now fueled by adrenaline, and a grim sense of purpose began to prepare. He couldn't stay hidden. He wouldn't make Abigail a prisoner in her own home. They'll use perdition as their base, Jed reasoned, pacing the small confines of the cabin. His limp was less pronounced. His shoulder, though still tender, allowed for a greater range of motion. They'll spread the word about the reward. Try to turn the whole damn territory against me. Abigail watched him, her expression a mixture of fear and resolve. "What are we going to do, Jed?" The "we" was unspoken but understood. She was in this now, whether she liked it or not. Her act of compassion had bound her to his fate. "I need to draw them out," Jed said, his jaw tight. "Away from here. Away from you." "And how do you plan to do that?" Abigail challenged, her hands on her hips. "Ride into perdition and announce your presence. You're still not at full strength. They'll gun you down before you can clear leather." He knew she was right. A direct confrontation in town on their terms would be suicide. He needed an edge, an element of surprise, and he needed to ensure Abigail's safety above all else. "There's an old line shack up in the foothills of the Dragoons," Jed said, thinking aloud. "Abandoned. My father and I used it years ago when we were trapping. It's defensible if you know the terrain." He looked at her. "If I can lure them there." "Lure them?" Abigail raised an eyebrow. "You make it sound like trapping beaver." A grim smile touched Jed's lips. "Not far off. Men like Silas, they're driven by greed. They think I have that map or know its secrets. They won't risk killing me outright until they're sure they have what they want. But Cutter and Finn, they didn't seem like men interested in prolonged negotiation," Abigail countered. "They're dogs on Silas's leash," Jed said. "Silas is the one I need to flush out. He's smarter, more cautious. He won't show his hand unless he thinks he has the advantage." Their planning was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Not Cutter and Finn this time, but a figure far more familiar to Abigail Doc Miller from Perdition. He was a portly man in his late 50s, with a kind face, a perpetually worried expression, and hands surprisingly gentle for a man who'd seen as much frontier brutality as he had. He made infrequent rounds to the outlying homesteads, and Abigail's farm was on his route. "Abigail, my dear Doc Miller," said, reining in his tired-looking mare. His gaze fell on Jed, who stood on the porch, his Colt Patterson now openly holstered at his hip. The doctor's eyes widened slightly, but he kept his composure. "Didn't expect to see you had company." Abigail, after a quick, reassuring glance from Jed, managed a polite smile. "Doc Miller, this is a friend. Jed. He's been helping out around the farm." Doc Miller dismounted his medical bag in hand. "A friend, you say?" His gaze was shrewd, taking in Jed's still healing bruises, the way he favored his shoulder. "Looks like this friend has seen some rough trails recently." There was no point in lying to Doc Miller. He was known for his discretion, and beneath his sometimes fussy exterior, a core of decency. Abigail had always trusted him. "He was ambushed," Doc Abigail said quietly. "Left for dead. I found him by the river." Doc Miller's eyebrows shot up. He looked from Abigail to Jed, his expression serious. "And now I wager the men who ambushed him are asking questions in town, offering a reward for a thief." Jed nodded. Silas Blackwood, and his men Cutter and Finn. Doc Miller let out a low whistle. Silas Blackwood. Nasty piece of work, that one. He and his crew rode into Perdition a few days ago, bold as brass. Been flashing money around, asking about a man who supposedly double-crossed them. He looked at Jed. "That'd be you, I take it." "It would," Jed confirmed. "They've got Sheriff Brody in their pocket, or near enough." Doc Miller continued, his voice grim. Brody was a man known more for his love of whiskey and poker than for upholding the law. "Don't expect any help from that quarter." A heavy silence descended. Doc Miller, however, surprised them. "Abigail," he said, his voice softening, "your mother was a good woman. Helped my wife through the influenza when no one else would come near. I owe her a debt." He looked at Jed. "And you, son, you look like you could use a friend who isn't beholden to Silas Blackwood." Jed and Abigail exchanged a look of cautious hope. An ally. An unexpected one, but potentially invaluable. "What are you proposing?" Doc Jed asked. "Blackwood's men are watching the trails the river," Doc Miller said. "They're expecting you to run or to make a mistake. But Silas himself, he's been spending most of his time at the Lucky Spur Saloon, playing poker and waiting." He paused. "He's arrogant. Believes he's got everything under control. We need to draw him out," Jed said. "To a place of my choosing." Doc Miller stroked his chin thoughtfully. "It'd have to be something he couldn't resist. Something that makes him believe you're desperate willing to negotiate." An idea began to form in Jed's mind, audacious and risky. "The map," he said. "He wants the map to the San Saba mine." "You still have it?" Doc Miller asked, surprised. Jed shook his head. "No, they took everything. But Silas doesn't know that for sure. He might think I had a copy or memorized it." "So you offer him the map?" Abigail asked, her brow furrowed. "I offer him a meeting," Jed corrected, "to discuss terms for the map. Alone. Just him and me. At the old line shack in the Dragoons. He'll never go for it," Abigail said immediately. "He'll suspect a trap. Not if the message comes from a trusted source," Jed said, looking at Doc Miller. Someone he wouldn't suspect of being allied with me. Doc Miller's eyes widened as he understood. You want me to deliver this message to approach Silas Blackwood? You're respected, Doc, Jed said, plausibly neutral. You could say you treated me that I'm desperate, holed up, and wanting to make a deal before his men find me. You could even imply you're doing it for a cut to make it more believable. Doc Miller looked distinctly uncomfortable. He was a healer, not a conspirator. But then he looked at Abigail, at the quiet strength in her face, the unspoken plea in her eyes. He sighed. Silas Blackwood is a dangerous man, if he suspects. It's a risk, Doc, I know, Jed said. But it's the best chance we have to get him on my terms, away from his men, away from town. And what about Cutter and Finn? Abigail asked. Even if Silas agrees to meet you alone, what's to stop them from following him or coming here? That's where timing comes in, Jed said. Doc, when you deliver the message, you make it clear the meeting is urgent. Tonight, at moonrise. That gives them less time to plan, less time to get organized. He then turned to Abigail, and that's where you come in. I need you to create a diversion. Something to keep Cutter and Finn occupied, or at least looking in the wrong direction while I deal with Silas. Abigail's eyes widened. A diversion. What kind of diversion? Jed's expression was grim. Something they can't ignore. The plan was desperate, fraught with peril at every turn. It relied on Silas's greed, overcoming his caution, on Doc Miller's courage, and on Abigail's ability to play a dangerous game. Doc Miller, after a long moment of internal debate, finally nodded. All right, he said, his voice heavy with reluctance, but also a newfound determination. I'll do it. For your mother, Abigail. And because men like Blackwood shouldn't be allowed to run roughshod over decent folk. He picked up his medical bag. I'll ride back to Perdition. Find Blackwood. But Jedediah, you be careful. That man is a viper. I know, Doc, Jed said. I've been bitten once. I don't intend for it to happen again. As Doc Miller rode off, a lone figure heading back towards the den of wolves, Jed and Abigail looked at each other. The die was cast. Confrontation was no longer a distant threat. It was hours away. Are you sure about this? Jed Abigail asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jed reached out his hand, briefly touching her arm. It was a hesitant gesture, uncharacteristic for him, but it conveyed a depth of feeling he couldn't put into words. No, he admitted. But it's the only way I see to end this, and to keep you safe. Abigail's gaze met his, her blue eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and an unwavering loyalty that humbled him. Then we see it through, she said, her voice firm. Together. The air grew colder as dusk bled into night. A sliver of moon, pale and ghostly, struggled to pierce the gathering clouds. Jedediah Stone stood at the edge of the tree line, overlooking the dilapidated line shack. It was a small, ramshackle structure, barely visible in the gloom, nestled in a hollow at the base of the Dragoon foothills. He'd chosen this spot carefully. It offered limited approaches, good cover, and an escape route into the rugged terrain behind, if things went truly sour. He checked his Colt Patterson for what felt like the 100th time, the familiar click of the cylinder, a small reassurance. His rifle, the Winchester, Abigail had given him, leaned against a nearby rock. His body thrummed with a mixture of anticipation and a cold, familiar dread. This was it, the culmination of Silas Blackwood's treachery and his own desperate fight for survival. He thought of Abigail. Earlier, as the last light faded, She had ridden out not towards perdition, but in the opposite direction, towards the old abandoned grist mill further downriver. Her part of the plan was perilous to start a fire, a significant blaze that would be visible for miles, drawing the attention of anyone in perdition, especially the easily distracted Cutter and Finn. It was a gamble. Would they take the bait? Would she be safe? The thought gnawed at him, a counterpoint to the immediate threat of Silas. Doc Miller had played his part perfectly, or so Jed hoped. The doctor was to have approached Silas in the Lucky Spur, spinning a tale of a broken, desperate Jedediah Stone, willing to trade the location of the San Saba mine for safe passage out of the territory. The meeting was set for moonrise at this very shack, alone. Jed scanned the darkness. Nothing. Only the sigh of the wind through the pines and the distant yip of a lone coyote. Was Silas coming? Or had he seen through the ruse? The waiting was the hardest part, a slow tightening of the nerves. Then a flicker of movement on the low ridge to his left. A lone rider, silhouetted against the faint moonlight. Jed tensed his hand, hovering near his colt. The rider approached cautiously, stopping 100 yards from the shack. Even at this distance, Jed recognized the posture, the way the man sat his horse. Silas Blackwood. Silas didn't ride directly to the shack. He dismounted, tethered his horse to a scrub pine, and approached on foot, moving with a predator's stealth, his eyes scanning the shadows. He was no fool. Jed remained hidden, letting Silas reach the clearing in front of the shack. Silas stopped, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered pistol. Stone. Silas called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. You in there? Or are you too yellow to show your face? Jed waited a moment longer, letting the silence stretch, then stepped out from behind the trees, his rifle held loosely at his side. Blackwood. Silas's lips curled into a smirk. He looked Jed up and down, taking in his still gaunt appearance, the faint signs of his recent injuries. Well, well. Look what the river coughed up. Thought you'd be buzzard bait by now. You thought wrong, Jed said, his voice even. So the good doctor wasn't lying. Silas said, his eyes glittering with avarice. You're ready to deal. Smart man. Saves us both a lot of trouble. He gestured towards the shack. The map, or the location. Let's have it. Not so fast, Silas, Jed said, taking a slow step forward. We had a deal. Partners. You broke that. Silas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Partnerships change. Opportunities arise. You were a means to an end, Stone. Nothing more. And now Jed pressed. What's to stop you from putting a bullet in me once you have what you want? My word, Silas said, though his eyes held no sincerity. Give me the location of the San Saba, and I'll let you ride out of this territory with what's left of your miserable life. My business is with the gold, not with you anymore. Jed knew it was a lie. Silas wouldn't leave a loose end a witness, not one he'd already tried to kill. The information I have is valuable, Silas, Jed said, playing along. Worth more than just my life. I want a stake, a real one this time. Silas's smirk widened. Still greedy, Stone. Even with one foot in the grave, he took another step closer. Let's not play games. The map, now. As Silas spoke, Jed saw it. A faint orange glow in the distance, far to the east, in the direction of the old grist mill. Abigail. She'd done it. The diversion. Silas, his attention focused solely on Jed, and the prize he believed was within his grasp hadn't noticed. "The map isn't written down, Silas," Jed said, his voice dropping slightly. "It's up here." He tapped his temple. "And the price for it is your life." Silas's eyes narrowed. The smirk vanished, replaced by a cold fury. "You damn fool. You think you can—" Before Silas could finish his sentence or draw his weapon, Jed acted. He dropped the rifle and dived to the side, his hand a blur as it went for the Colt Patterson. He'd practiced the move 100 times in his mind, compensating for his still-healing shoulder. Silas, caught off guard by Jed's sudden aggression, reacted a split second too late. His own gun was clearing leather as Jed's Colt bucked in his hand. Crack! The shot echoed through the silent foothills. Silas grunted, staggering back, clutching his shoulder, a mirror image of the wound Jed had suffered. But Silas was tough, fueled by rage and desperation. He brought his own pistol up, firing wildly. Jed felt a searing pain graze his arm, but he ignored it. He fired again, a more deliberate shot. This time Silas cried out a choked, gurgling sound and stumbled, his gun clattering to the ground. He clutched his chest, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Jed advanced cautiously, his Colt still trained on Silas. The outlaw sank to his knees, blood blossoming on his shirt. Should have just killed you cleanly." Silas gasped, his voice wet. "You should have kept your word, Silas," Jed said, his voice devoid of emotion. Suddenly the sound of approaching horses fast. Jed's head snapped up. Cutter and Finn. The diversion hadn't held them as long as he'd hoped. Or perhaps Silas had a contingency plan. He didn't have time to wonder. Two figures burst into the clearing, guns drawn. Cutter bellowing with rage, and Finn, his face pale and terrified, but his gun pointed at Jed. Boss Cutter roared, seeing Silas on the ground. He raised his pistol, aiming at Jed. Jed reacted on pure instinct. He fired at Cutter a quick shot that went wide as he simultaneously ducked behind the meager cover of a weathered water trough near the shack. Splinters flew as Cutter's bullet slammed into the wood where Jed's head had been. Finn, seeing his chance, fired wildly in Jed's direction, the bullets thudding into the side of the shack. Jed was pinned down, 2 against 1, and they had the angle. He risked a quick glance. Cutter was advancing, using the sparse trees for cover, while Finn laid down, suppressing fire. Then a new sound, a shout high-pitched and furious from the direction of the shack's darkened doorway. "Get away from him!" A figure burst from the shack. Abigail. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be miles away, safe. In her hands, she wielded the old Winchester with a surprising ferocity. Boom! The heavy report of the rifle was deafening. Finn screamed, dropping his gun and clutching his leg, collapsing to the ground. Abigail's sudden appearance, firing from their flank, momentarily stunned Cutter. He hesitated, turning towards this new threat. It was the opening Jed needed. He rose from behind the trough, his Colt steady, and fired 2 shots in quick succession. Cutter grunted his advance, faltering. He took another step, then slowly, like a great tree falling, he crashed to the ground. Silence descended, broken only by Finn's whimpering and Silas's ragged, dying breaths. Jed rushed to Abigail, his heart pounding. "Abigail. What in God's name are you doing here? You were supposed to—" "The fire didn't draw them all," she said, her face smudged with soot, her eyes wide but resolute. "I saw them split up. 2 headed this way. I couldn't leave you to face them alone." She'd circled back, risking everything to come to his aid. Jed didn't know what to say. Her courage, her loyalty left him speechless. He turned his attention back to Silas. The outlaw was fading fast, his eyes glazing over. "The San Saba." Silas wheezed, a bloody froth on his lips. It's cursed." Then, with a final shuddering gasp, Silas Blackwood lay still. Jed looked at Abigail, then at the carnage around them. Finn was moaning, trying to staunch the flow of blood from his leg. Cutter lay motionless. Silas, the architect of so much pain and betrayal, was dead. It was over. But as Jed looked at Abigail, her face pale but determined, standing amidst the chaos with the smoking Winchester in her hands, he knew that something else had just begun. The fight for survival had ended, but the fight for a future that now inexplicably included this brave farm girl, was just starting. The shots had been fired, the immediate threat neutralized. But the echoes of the violence and the choices they had made would resonate for a long time to come. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky, Abigail finally voiced the question that had been hovering between them. "What will you do now, Jed? Will you stay?" Jed looked out at the land, at the fields they had worked together, at the small cabin that had become a home. He thought of the violence he had known, the rootless existence. And then he looked at Abigail, her clear blue eyes fixed on him, her expression open, hopeful. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers closing gently around hers. "I've been running for a long time, Abigail," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "From the war, from myself, from men like Silas. I'm tired of running." He met her gaze, his own unwavering. "If you'll have me, I'd like to stop running. Right here." A slow smile spread across Abigail's face, a smile that lit up her eyes and chased away the last shadows of fear. "This farm, it's always been a lonely place," she said softly. "It wouldn't be with you here." There were no grand pronouncements, no flowery declarations, just a simple understanding forged in shared hardship and sealed with a quiet hope for the future. The San Saba gold, if it ever existed, remained a legend, a whisper in the vastness of the territory. Jedediah Stone had found a different kind of treasure, one more valuable than any precious metal, a chance at redemption, a place to belong, and a love as resilient and true as the frontier spirit itself. The Cimarron River continued its timeless journey, its waters carrying away the echoes of violence, leaving behind a quiet farm where two souls once lost and broken had found their way to a new beginning under the wide, watchful sky of the west. The Colt Patterson was still there, cleaned and oiled, but now it rested in a drawer, a relic of a past laid to rest, replaced by the tools of a life being built, one day at a time. And so the river that was meant to be Jedediah's grave became his salvation, leading him to a love he never expected, and a life he thought he'd lost forever. Abigail's courage rewrote their destinies, proving that even in the harshest corners of the Wild West, hope can take root and flourish. Their tale is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are not found in gold, but in the bonds we forge in the face of adversity. If their story of survival, betrayal, and unexpected love gripped your heart, don't let it end here. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this adventure with fellow fans of gritty Western dramas, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more tales from the wild frontier. We've got a lot more stories to tell, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thanks for listening, partners.